Yes, I've known Ruth for years. We joined the department at roughly around the same time. Um, some of you know her as the undergraduate English advisor. Many of you know her as a thesis advisor. Too many of you know her as a thesis advisor or second or third reader. Or you've taken classes from her on 19th century British literature, feminist and cultural theory, Victorianist, yay, Victorian studies, including major authors and genres, particularly the spiritual crisis of the 19th century, which is part of what went into her 1995 book, Reclaiming Myths of Power, the Victorian Spiritual Crisis and Women Writers. She's also written on Victorian children's literature from a feminist cultural angle. And that is her most recent, Victorian children's literature, Experiencing Abjection, Empathy, and the Power of Love, which uses particularly Julia Kristeva as a lens to look at the literature. She's published in a variety of journals, Milas, Lion and the Unicorn, Children's Literature Association Quarterly, Writing on the Edge, Faber Studies, English Language Notes, Minnesota Review, da-da, 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 da-da. You went to a really cool colloquium symposium on Kristevan studies, I understand, so that was cool. I know every time I have an opportunity to talk to Ruth about what she's doing, it always sounds so cool, and I have to add new things to my reading list because there's obviously like tons of things I have missed. I think we're in for a treat today when she will be talking about embodying empathy from voicing abjection to speaking likenesses. And speaking likenesses is also the main work that you would talk about. So, Ruth.
Well, welcome, and thank you, Lisa. And I also want to thank Bryce and Megan for all the work they've done today, and the papers that I got to hear were really very good. So it was exciting. So, what I'm presenting today are threads from my most recent book, which is Victorian Children's Literature, Experiencing Abjection, Empathy, and the Power of Love. To begin, I'd like to create some context for the questions and concerns that inform this paper and have intrigued and even troubled me for much of my professional life. Every few years, I feel compelled to assess what I'm doing. Does it have value? Is it indulgent? Does it hold any relevance beyond this campus or in academia in general? Well, I've never had any difficulty justifying teaching writing. For me, that is basically an act of social justice. I could justify what I felt to be somewhat selfish in the time I spent reading and thinking and writing about literature when balanced with that. However, the violence and hatred, the mass shootings, the hate crimes, the increased polarization that has increased in recent years has forced me to think about why it's happening and how it might be changed. As a result, I've had to conclude that engaging with imaginative literature, writing or reading it, is essential because it can serve as a means to learn and develop empathy. In short, engaging in imaginative literature could be a means of survival. Perhaps English majors, and some of you have heard me say this in class, might save the world. Okay, that may be a bit dramatic, but one cannot spend decades reading Darwin without thinking about how species thrive through interconnectedness and diversity, or Mill contending that eccentricity or individualism are vital to a culture's success. Okay, that's probably enough. But what I want to suggest is that engaging in narrative, whether it's self-story or fiction, may develop individuals with empathetic and compassionate values rather than xenophobic, ethnocentric, and competitive ones that dominate our relationships and public discourse today. I also want to clarify the theoretical foundation that supports these ideas. I've been intrigued by Julia Kristeva since reading Revolution in Poetic Language in the 80s as a graduate student. So I've been unraveling the threads, tightly entwined threads, of that conceptual tapestry to weave into my own scholarship and understanding of identity and relationship. For those of you not familiar with Kristeva, she's a linguist, philosopher, Bulgarian emigre settled in Paris, as well as a working psychologist. In her practice in Paris, she uses narrative and self-story to help teenagers de-radicalize and find more productive outlets than terror to respond to their needs. She insists upon life and art, production and reflection, and mind and body as necessarily interconnectional and intersectional, and I find that compelling. I also want to unpack some of the concepts that are central to what I'm going to say, beginning with the idea of metaphor, of which I think most of us are familiar. We know that metaphors are artistic alchemy, creating something new. Kristeva posits specifically that a lack of metaphoricalness leads to phobia, to fear, to anxiety. A lack of metaphoricalness is an inability to see connections between disparate objects, the inability to embrace ambiguity. It is a need for absolutes, for distinct binaries of right or wrong, good or bad. It is a fear of losing control. So an inability to think metaphorically results in fear and anxiety because connections can only be seen between like and like. Difference can only be read as other than, potentially threatening to the self. So what is metaphoricalness? For Kristeva, metaphor is love. Juliana Denoy explains what she means. Metaphor is a dissolving of borders, finding what is the same between two seemingly different objects, and as a result, metaphor enables the introduction of love or connection, mutuality, into language. How this might lead to empathy, though, what we might simply define as an ability to feel another's emotions, to recognize another's needs, to recognize, as George Eliot writes in Middlemarch, someone else's equivalent center of self. Magdalena Nowak describes empathy as a conscious relationship with the external world, with a world beyond the self. This is a relationship of difference, not a projection of one's own needs and desires. Another key concept is abjection, which is a way to understand difference. Abjection can be understood as whatever threatens our sense of being intact, of being secure. It can be disruptions in protocol or conventions, of bodily experience in an abstract space, or the threatening of boundaries of a homogeneous space. An important question is how one can develop experience in relationship with a difference or objection without the fear of being consumed or destroyed by that other. Christine Wilkie Stibbs suggests that literature may provide a space for this process because one may lose oneself in another's psyche without risking an actual loss of self. Literature can offer transgressive scripts without prohibition. Fear and anxiety can be sublimated into healthier, more productive responses through metaphoric thinking. Literature often offers imaginative transference, and narratives are a particularly rich space in which to consider this process, regardless of being the writer or the reader. Transference, another important concept, is fundamentally an emotional relationship with another that is transformative. Adapted to narrative, the bond that is established between speaker and listener, writer and reader, can be equally transformative when the relationship is one of affirmation. Kristeva describes the primary role of the listener or reader as to listen and confirm belief, to acknowledge and authenticate the value of the experience. This productive relationship depends on hearing, not dismissing, censoring, or foreclosing possibilities. constructing one's story through a narrative exchange where judgment is replaced by affirmation can, in Kristeva's thinking, reawaken or resurrect the imagination, what she defines as a discourse of transference or of love. We willingly suspend our disbelief, and doing so, open ourselves up to feel another's experience. Through language, adolescents can explore possibility, sublimating trauma and desire in story, draft potential scripts of experience that need not be enacted. That is, they can perform desperate identities, experiment with stories different from their own, and even transgress cultural expectations without sanction. This is in part because the reader does not extract a text meaning, but participates in the creation of that meaning. Named as if scripts, these narratives allow for the writer or the reader to imagine another's experience, needs, and fears, to develop and practice empathy. At the heart of this process is affirming the speaker, enabling space for the story to be told and attended to rather than dismissing it, acknowledging, functioning as what Kristeva would call a beloved authority. The difference contributes toward the speaker becoming individuated, constructing his or own moral values rather than simply adopting familial, communal, or cultural values wholesale. This affirmation implies that one hears the discourse with empathy, which requires an imaginative connection, a splitting of self to experience the other. Consequently, one can understand the way in which storytelling itself becomes an act of hopeful love because it engages the listener or the reader in a bond of identification. In short, imaginatively experiencing another's perspective nurtures the empathy that is essential for experiencing, not just intellectualizing, ourselves in the other and the other in ourselves. Through this recognition, the binary to absolutes of a rigid world view collapse. Instead, an inclusive dynamics of the multiplicity of both and, reflecting an ethical process in which the dissolution of boundaries creates love as a metaphoric product. I want to illustrate this process with Christina Rossetti's short work for readers, Speaking Likenesses. Here, Rossetti offers readers a trilogy of stories told by an aunt to her nieces, all of whom knit, mend, draw, or sew during the telling. The relationship between the aunt and her nieces propels the story, framing and inspiring the narratives that develop toward connection and empathy, and away from hierarchical values and narcissistic responses. The first story recounts the adventures of Flora on her 8th birthday. The second tells of a little girl, Edith, whose independent venture out of doors to boil water for a picnic tea is unsuccessful. And the final story is of Maggie, a young orphan who returns a forgotten package to its owner. From its initial publication as a Christmas book in 1874, Speaking Likenesses has elicited a range of befuddled and even dismissive responses. John Ruskin described it as the worst children's book ever written. Roderick McGillis would later describe it as being frightening and with disturbing images and action. A 1959 Times Literary Supplement judged it as a particularly revolting book. And in short, as Andrea Caston notes, nearly everyone found something disturbing about Rossetti's book. Perhaps the aggressive characters or the images contained in the book could not be reconciled with their perception of Christina Rossetti, a distinctly feminine poet who writes children's and devotional works, or as Ruskin notes, pretty nursery rhymes. Although a few readers described it as a pale shade of Alice, Carol's book, Speaking Likenesses is in fact more of a response to Carol. With this book, Rossetti presents her readers with an opportunity for free play and participation in imaginative understanding. Despite critics reading it as some kind of aberration of her style, Speaking Likenesses does share some methodological similarities with her other writing for children. She consistently constructs texts that invite engagement as either an imaginative participant in the creative world, or as modeled through the dynamic relationships with a forward and backward quality. Speaking likenesses both in content and in its recursive crochet-like structure that echoes the knitting, mending, and sewing found in the content of the book, bringing forward previously introduced images or ideas to be subsequently set into relief against a new image or idea. Speaking likenesses imaginatively embodies the process and reveals a complex, interwoven, interdependent text that provides young readers with an opportunity to embody the experience of the connections. Comparing weaving to the dialectical interplay between the potential meaning and symbolic articulation, Kristeva emphasizes that unlike a finished product, this dynamic is not static. This process of being made, of negotiating one's relationship between possibility and form, is central to both textual and identity construction. In this way, Rossetti constructs a text that announces itself with plural identity, frames the story with images of process, and builds the tale as collaborative experiences both from the interjected responses of the nieces and from the threads introduced previously in the stories. Rossetti's title establishes the importance of this process in Speaking Likenesses. In a letter to Macmillan, she insists, "I really must adopt Speaking Likenesses as my title," explaining that her small heroine perpetually encounters speaking, literally speaking, likenesses or embodiments or caricatures of themselves and their faults. Understood in this way, the title offers the reader a mode for understanding the stories. That is, speaking is active. The process of articulating the likenesses of metaphoric experiences can evoke love through collapsing difference. Perhaps the formal feature most disturbing to many critical readers is the series of interjections woven through the three stories of Speaking Likenesses, of which, of course, they find the aunt's response the most offensive. She is variously described as didactic, caustic, sarcastic, irascible, stern, and facetious. She's even reduced by Roderick McGillis as to a, quote, sad and sometimes bitter parable of a lonely lady, close quote. What is so striking about these responses is that they fail to acknowledge or recognize the creative dynamic established through this dialogue, interspersed in and between the stories of the trilogy. If, however, the interwoven dialogue is read instead as part of the process of narrative interaction, as illustrative of interactive reading-listening process, the dialogic interactions between the aunt and her nieces become an integral part of the book, weaving together the frame and the stories. Understood as interplay rather than restrictive monitoring, the dynamic between the aunt and her nieces helps establish the importance of the imagination. This is established in the very first paragraph of Speaking Likenesses, even if with a serious tone. The aunt begins her narration with "come," an invitation to sit around her for her dear little girls, so she can tell a story. Not only does the aunt initiate the event as one of storytelling, but she also identifies the girls in relation to her. They are my girls, and they are dear to her. She positions herself as one in a circle, emphasized by her directions not to look at her, but their occupations. And although she does insist that the girls engage in some creative act, drawing or mending, she engages as well, telling them and the reader that she will start her knitting and the story together. This is a circle of productivity and community, more reciprocal than hierarchical, with the aunt functioning more as a mentor than a stern authoritarian. In collaboration with her nieces, the aunt develops a trilogy of stories. She responds to their questions and requests and even relates their actions to the actions of the characters in these narratives. This begins immediately. Also in the very first paragraph, the aunt comments on Maud's pout. But rather than read Maud's reaction solely as resistance, the aunt uses it to initiate her story. She determines that Maud's grumbling and pouting are a sad but not inappropriate beginning to the story. Rather than insist on binary values, she's either good or bad, the aunt uses Maud's abject response to create something new, building a more complex intersectional story within her story. In addition to the interwoven dialogue, the framed story provides readers more developed instruction in relational dynamics. Contrary to the stern retorts generally attributed to the aunt, she engages in a gentle negotiation with her nieces, even offering them options to remain in the circle. On the second day they gather, the girls enthusiastically request that she tell them the unfinished story about the frog in the kettle introduced but never told in the first story. The aunt responds, however, "But I was not there to hear." When told that she must know it, the aunt answers, "Indeed I do not," but adds, "I can imagine reasons why a frog would not and should not boil a kettle, but I have never heard any such stated." The aunt's response challenges the idea of absolutes. There is more than one story or version of the story of the frog in the kettle. She does eventually accept the plea from her nieces to enact the qualities she has extolled in them, to try, when they remind her that she is always telling them to try. Recognizing these responses as part of a dialogue, rather than inappropriate backtalk or impertinence, the aunt responds, "Fairly put, Jane, I will try." The aunt adds a condition, however, reiterating not only the interplay of weaving a story and weaving their work, but also she requests that they all help her with her sewing. The conversation that follows this request foregrounds a dynamic of mutual respect, as well as the values developed in the trilogy, replacing narcissism with compassion. Maud complains, "We got through our work yesterday." The aunt, accepting her statement, responds, "Very well, as you like." But she does offer Maud a choice. Only no help, no story. The aunt presents Ella with a similar choice when she notices that her niece is distracted, saying, "If you would rather go to your music, don't stay listening out of ceremony." Of course, if she stays, Ella can work on plenty of buttonholes needing to be overcast. In her analysis of Rossetti's sing-song, Virginia Sickbert develops the importance for Rossetti of offering choices rather than edicts, illustrating how the speaker creates options for the children. She notes, however, that the one choice the speaker does not offer is the choice to remain silent, creating a relationship that is not coercive but protective and loving. She requests that in return for the stories she creates, her nieces use their time compassionately. The aunt tells the girls that she has too many poor friends ever to get through her work, embodying the values she asks of them. Upon seeing thimbles coming out, the aunt asks them to listen and begins. The second instance of conversation between the aunt and her niece separates the second and third narratives and offers another instance of relational dynamics. Coming upon her nieces mysteriously whispering, the aunt asks why. She is told that it is only that Jane and Maud want a winter story someday, given that the others have been set in summer. Not only does the aunt respond to Maud, "If Jane and you wish for a winter story, my next shall freeze hard," but she is also reestablishing the tone of amiability between herself and her nieces, enthusiastically agreeing to their request. When Maud qualifies her explanation of the mysterious whispering, she says, "That's all, Auntie dear." She prompts her aunt to make her own request, but don't say only as if I were finding fault with you, as well as repeating the diminutive of her name, Maudie dear. With the aunt's willingness to comply despite the short notice, the circle is reestablished, and even Ella sits down too. "Here is my work for all of you," she says, same as yesterday. "And here comes my story." Thus, the respect for both voices in her dialogues and for the connection between speakers that Sickbert recognizes in Sing Song, a collection of poems for children of Rossetti's. is present in speaking likenesses as well, modeling what Sigbert describes as a bond that allows for respect for self as well as others. The relationship between the aunt and her nieces provide readers with examples of ethical connections that are developed through love. Andrea Caston notes that blurring boundaries is the project of Rossetti, complicating rigid distinctions between cultural definitions of gender-appropriate behaviors, genres, and relationships. The frame story further illustrates this, developing toward an ending that does not, in fact, differentiate between itself and the third story, the process and the concepts at the conclusion of speaking likeness. The disillusion of the frame begins subtly with the slight asides integrated into the stories, the aunt suggesting, for instance, that her nieces had most likely never seen such an abundance of dishes and decanters as described in the story. During the second story, the aunt, in a bracketed comment, wonders about no remarks, by her nieces so far, but welcomes the question about tripods. Implicit in the aunt's comment is an expectation of a dynamic relationship, not one of rigid boundaries between her telling the story and her nieces listening to it. By her third story, the aunt makes another aside, one that does more than simply comment on their limited experience. Here, reflecting on Maggie's sudden remembrance of her promise to make haste, the aunt both points to the interconnected quality of the trilogy, but also acknowledges that her nieces do have the imaginative experience now to recognize the abject horror of the games of pincushion and self-help Maggie is having to decline. Ella asks if these children are in fact the monstrous ones from Flora's story, and after confirming that they are, the aunt subsequently adds that you and I, who have peeped behind the scenes, know that Maggie would have had no very delightful treat. This intersection of a remembered promise that elevates one's relationship and the benefit of the listener's imaginative experience advances the reader's empathy. Perhaps equally important, the aunt reinforces their mutual experience as it is you and I, not simply you or I, of this shared experiential knowledge. Speaking likenesses concludes not with the frame distinct from the trilogy, but with a homely image of love between generations and species, generated by understanding what Kristeva would describe as the stranger within. In Strangers to Ourselves, Kristeva articulates this, writing that being in the stranger's place means to imagine and make oneself other for oneself. For Kristeva, this experience serves as a journey into the strangeness of the other, toward an ethics of respect for the irreconcilable. As Wilkie Stibbs has illustrated, literary transference enables this as well, offering readers the opportunity to experience lives different from their own, what George Eliot defines as the value of literature. Consequently, reading of this welcoming hug that Maggie receives from her grandmother, the contented pigeon, the sleeping kitten, and the cordial puppy, all reconciled, encounters from her journey to the doctor's home are compounded and acknowledged with an experience of countertransference and an ethics of love. Examining the trilogy of the stories themselves may also help to illustrate this process. Read together, the stories demonstrate the process from aggressive narcissism to empathy and love, deepening the experience of the framed story. Flora's story is one of being socialized into a girl with more culturally appropriate behavior, and is the one most often compared to Carol's Alice books, in that she must emerge from an imaginative world where she learns to be more contrite, more mannerly, and more congenial in growing closer toward her cultural roles. What Caston describes as Flora's inability to be a good hostess, having been rude and self-indulgent to her birthday guests, has been replaced by generous and thoughtful behavior after this experience. Flora has learned not simply to display decorous behavior, she has learned the value of caring for another. When Flora abandons her birthday guests to pout about not being the center of attention, she is transported to another world where she is confronted with a barrage of aggressive behavior. She is assaulted in the dreadful sport of hunt the pincushion, during which she is the pincushion, is cut, had her frock caught and slit, swung violently around. Flora must endure self-help, where the boys were players, but the girls were played, with a slap, a box on the ear, a prick, and a scratch. She encounters the birthday queen, her likeness, who embodies narcissism. The queen and her subjects exchange insults, begin to quarrel, and essentially preclude any possibility for connection, perhaps best illustrated by the queen enclosing herself in a block glass structure, where, upset, the queen clutched, shook, hurled the first stone, initiating a hailstorm that results in glass clattering, shivering with moans and groans as she prepares to launch a massive slab toward her subjects. Recognizing the uselessness, even destructiveness, of the queen's narcissistic behavior, half mad with fear because the queen insists on destroying her subjects, Flora flung herself after the slab through the breach to prevent this, and in a wholly unselfish act. It's at this point that Flora is transported back to her world. Acting not from desires, but for another's need is what enables Flora to free herself from the antagonism, fear, and destructive world of her personified narcissism. The second story of the trilogy, Edith's transgressive attempts to boil water for tea, has prompted the most commentary, usually to judge the story as pointless or unnecessary. I would argue, however, that with it the aunt can illustrate a breakdown of the process from a lack of creative possibility resulting from denying the other. The aunt's willingness to try and tell the story of the frog in the kettle demonstrates mutual respect between herself and her nieces. Everyone, including the aunt, must commit to participating. And with the process reinitiated, the sewing and mending begun, the aunt prepares her nieces for the imaginative breach of conventional norms, telling them that the frog and his peers will have to talk, of course. The aunt illustrates the need to artistically suspend disbelief, to relax the rigid divisions of what is conventional and what is different, between the self and the other, to generate a new beginning, a new story. Edith's story, in contrast, depicts what happens when one cannot. Consumed by her own desires, Edith cannot exist in a reciprocal relationship with the other that the aunt in the frame story has modeled for her nieces, so she fails. Knowing she is too young to light a fire, Edith nonetheless volunteers to do it, but in a way she knows will not be acknowledged, revealing that she was not very anxious to make herself heard, and as a result, the cook heard nothing beyond the child's voice saying something or other of no consequence. Unlike the reciprocal relationship between the aunt and her nieces enacted by satisfying another's needs, shared productivity, Edith proceeds from disconnection, focusing only on her own desires and becoming increasingly self-absorbed. So she offers neither respect nor attention to the animals who have gathered around her. Although initially a twig ignites, the spark smolders like Edith's own creative abilities. Despite the possibility of a productive relationship with the animals, Edith's resistance to consider another's experience prevents connection, precluding metaphorical thinking. Fact and fancy, nonetheless, both exist in the space. The aunt offers practical advice. Never put an empty kettle on the fire or you and it will rue the consequence. And she refers to the frog's contention that he knows things from living inside something. But Edith's experience can go nowhere because, although contained within the trilogy, it's outside the process. There is no acknowledgement of mutual needs and interests. When the frog reminds Edith to attend to the kettle, she retorts, "Boil it yourself." In response, the frog, now anxious to save his own credit, says, "I can't bear hot water." The fire is not lit, but the relationship between Edith and the frog combusts into acrimony. The potential spark, whether for the story or the fire, goes out. With that failure, the ant announces, "Here my story finishes." The story of the fire may have finished, but the ant continues, exaggerating the stalled nature of the twice aborted tale. We are told that Edith, in despair, sat down to cry, but with a series of subordinate clauses, her animal companions actively go about with their lives. The pigeons withdrew, the squirrel scudded up the beech tree, the mole vanished, the hedgehogs yawned, re-engaging in process. Edith's inability to recognize the possibility of acknowledging the other inevitably stymies development, progress, or new potential for her. Her tale then offers readers a glimpse at the consequences of a failed connection, in contrast to the growth and process that Flora gains through her compassionate act. With the ant's third story, Rossetti illustrates the transformative possibility of an ethics of love as Maggie comes to embody a love that propels her away from narcissism and towards compassion, enabling her to embrace others as she recognizes that their needs and desires parallel her own. In short, Maggie learns empathy. This process begins when she offers to return a package left behind by the doctor's family in her grandmother's shop. Although presented as an act of generosity, the reader learns that Maggie offers this because she's thinking of herself and the possibility of getting to see the doctor's Christmas tree. Her encounter going to their house and returning home mirror one another as well as her own feelings. Playing children, a hungry boy, an exhausted band of travelers. The likenesses that she faces during this journey evolve from pleasure-seeking to empathetic projection, and as a result, Maggie gains a more substantial reward than her initial desire to see the doctor's tree and possibly engage in holiday festivities. Rossetti integrates the speaking likenesses from the previous tales into Maggie's journey. She meets the children from Flora's tale, as well as the animosity of Edith's relationships. Re-encountering these moments, the reader may also reinterpret them from earlier inclusions in Flora's and Edith's stories, but doing so also aligns the reader with the nieces. With them, we've heard about these events and respond in kind. During her journey, Maggie struggles with her own desires as well as remembering being in a loving relationship with her grandmother. On her way to the doctor's house, Maggie thinks about how she should dearly love a game of play, and almost immediately she comes upon children sporting together. The children encourage Maggie to play, an invitation all the more tempting because she has no playmates back home. But she remembers her promise to her grandmother not to dawdle, so she turns them down. Having seen these children earlier and their hostile games, we know that Maggie's sacrifice is really a reward, even if she doesn't. The second likeness that Maggie encounters is more substantial, hunger. Realizing that she has not a crumb to share with a hungry wood pigeon, Maggie considers offering it some chocolate, but is prevented from doing so when she is startled by noises. Facing her is what seems to be a boy, with a fat tabby cat carrying in her mouth a tabby kitten. Maggie wonders if it's a real boy, because its face had only one feature, and that was a wide mouth that grinned, whined, and accosted her, demanding that she give a morsel to a poor starving beggar. The final encounter with her likeness occurs when, exhausted, Maggie comes upon some dozen persons sitting together, toasting themselves around a glowing gypsy fire, yawning, nodding, and snoring. Upon seeing them, she began to wish above all things that she might just sit down where she stood and go fast asleep, never mind food or fire or bed, only let her sleep. With the children, her memory of the promise made to her grandmother saves her from what for Flora was assault justified as play. Her recollection of this promise when she comes upon the sleeping traveler most likely saves her life. Her confrontation with the mouth boy illustrates a dynamic based primarily on a competitive narcissism that echoes Edith's story. Maggie refuses the boy food, proclaiming she's hungry enough herself. Rather than feel anything in this instance, whether the bouncing ball in her basket as if it longed for a game when she left the playing children, or the shared exhaustion experienced with the sleeper, Maggie shames the boy, so he hung his head, shut his mouth, and turn to go, essentially eliminating any chance for connection. When reaching the doctor's home, Maggie finally anticipates satisfying her two desires: return the forgotten package and perhaps be regaled with something nice, or be indulged with a glimpse of the Christmas tree. The package is returned, but echoing her own response to the mouth boy, she receives only a cursory thank you with no acknowledgement of her likely chill and hunger. She leaves to face a dim and solitary and comfortless forest, a fair likeness to herself and how she feels at this point. Rather than re-encounter her narcissistic likenesses on her way home, she meets with others with whom she can now recognize a connection on a more fundamental level: the need for food, shelter, and loving acknowledgement. This recognition enables Maggie to redirect attention from herself and her narcissistic desires to the needs of another, modeling her grandmother's own response to her as a child. Maggie picks up a motionless and half-frozen wood pigeon and snuggled it tenderly, kissed it, and laid it to get warm within the bosom of her frock. As a result, she feels the anger and discontent drawn out of her heart, left off grumbling, and stepped forward with renewed energy. Maggie subsequently encounters a small tabby kitten where she had previously met the mouth boy, and caught up the helpless creature, securing it in the basket that will soon also contain a despondent puppy left out in the cold. Maggie feels compassion in response to these encounters, embodying love rather than desire. During doing so, in addition to the animals she acquires on her journey home, Maggie gains a sight much more impressive than any Christmas tree, a vision of the Northern Lights. It is through her embodiment of compassion, as well as the relational energy this creates, that Maggie's actions illustrate a dynamic ethics of love. The love Maggie extends to the creature is given to her as she is welcomed home, not with just with a thank you, but with a loving, welcoming hug from her grandmother. In this relationship, between the love she feels from both the animals and her grandmother, Maggie finds emotional and material nourishment, is given a waiting tea, and begins to thaw along with the pigeon and the kitten. It's worth noting that at the story's ending, Maggie and her grandmother follow the good example set them by the puppy that had settled down to sleep. The energy is not unidirectional or hierarchical. It is a dynamic, mutually beneficial, engendered by what is needed. I want to conclude by returning to the role of the imagination in nurturing empathy. In Tales of Love, Kristeva writes, "Imagination succeeds where the narcissist and the paranoid fails. Imagination is a discourse of love. Love, like metaphor, dissolves boundaries between body and mind, between the self and other. An ethics of love is, as David Fisher describes, a signifying practice that is both and, not either or." And David Cranfield notes that such a dynamic focuses not so much on codes of behavior, but on developing how we construct our own identities in a non-narcissistic way. Vinciane Desprez suggests that the capacity for being affected and being able to affect is dependent on trust and interest. Witness, as he defines it, is a means to make an effort to become interested, to immerse oneself into the experience of an other. In short, it means to care. An ethics of love establishes obligations to one another not through rules and prohibitions, but compassion, creating a connection, perhaps enabled imaginatively, that can resolve crises, narcissism, and fear. Indeed, as Kelly Oliver clarifies, love enables the other to retain its otherness, its alterity, and still provide the lover with an image of herself. Consequently, this provides identification through difference without abolishing or assimilating that difference. So in a world in which interpersonal dynamics seem increasingly narcissistic and public discourse is barely more than competing monologues, we can respond by dissolving boundaries between ourselves and others to create a new, productive relationship that is built upon reciprocal respect in which we feel obligations toward one another. Literature offers the opportunity to imaginatively experience another, to learn to empathize, and perhaps to change the world.